Hi, everyone. My name is Leo Schuster. I'm the lead pastor of City Church in Houston, citychurch.org. Thank you so much for joining this edition of Instagram Live that we started in the wake of the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis. This today is really an interactive conversation, something of a follow-up to my message this past Sunday. By the way, our services are at 10:30 a.m. and 5 p.m. on Sundays at citychurch.org. I talked about this Sunday how I'd never lived. It occurred to me I'd never lived at a time where so many people simultaneously were suffering throughout the world. And to be sure that our suffering varies significantly in degree and form, but it's a time when a lot of people are suffering. And from my vantage point as a pastor, I realize that suffering is an occasion, oftentimes for people, either for finding God or fleeing from Him. And that's what I want to focus on today, how suffering is that moment, that season for a lot of people to move one way or the other spiritually. And I want you to know up front that I approach this not speculatively, but sympathetically, empathetically, actually, that I am a doubter by nature. I don't come to my faith easily. It's a difficult thing for me. And as I've mentioned before, and others like the great author Flannery O'Connor have said, that of the most acute forms of suffering, the suffering that people who are struggling to believe go through is way up there in the list. So I really appreciate that as we frame our time. So why is it that suffering is that occasion for either moving one way or the other spiritually for a lot of people in life? And that may be where you are today. The risk of being simplistic, think of yourself as a many layered person, maybe an onion. Think of concentric circles, and that our day-to-day lives under normal circumstances tends to be lived based on the assumptions, you can call them beliefs, that we have on those outer layers. For some people, those assumptions and beliefs are more distinctly religious. Certain beliefs about life have to do with a belief of God, in God. But for other people, those outer layers are based on other things. Maybe they're based on aspirations that you have in life, the kind of person that you want to be, the sense of happiness that's down there in the horizon somewhere that you're pushing toward in your life. That may involve a relationship, it might involve career aspirations, places where you might live, dreams you dream, that kind of thing. And then what happens is we hit disappointments in life. We hit seasons of trial and tribulation, and those outer layers get cracked because they prove not to be able to help us make it daily through life in the way that we had anticipated that they might. So life doesn't work. I realize it may sound very pragmatic, utilitarian, but I think oftentimes it comes down to that. We're trying to make sense of our life in that moment of suffering, and those outer layers prove not to be as helpful as we might have thought they would be. So take, for instance, two individuals. One, on the one hand, is someone who is not, by their own description, very religious. They're either utterly irreligious, or religion is, just an accessory to life. It's not really that significant to them. And the other person is someone who would self-describe as more religious. We'll get to them in just a minute. But for the person who wouldn't describe themselves maybe as very religious or not religious at all, life is going along and then it falls apart. That moment, as we said, challenges those assumptions, and it calls into question those outer layers. So maybe, for instance, one option of challenging those outer layers for the irreligious or less religious person would be calling into question outer layers of self-sufficiency. So my life, and I don't mean that pejoratively, I just mean that their life is built on assumptions that my life is going to be okay if I find that person and maybe get married, partner up, and move through life in that kind of a relationship, or a certain aspiration in terms of our career, or maybe it has to do with a sense of physical well-being. Those things that you put your confidence in give way. That outer exterior self-sufficiency cracks. And, one option is that you see that those weren't sufficient to depend upon in life. And so previously, maybe you never really had an interest in considering great metaphysical questions. Now you're more open to that. And a good example, a concrete example to go from the abstract to the concrete, is exactly what happened at a church that I had the privilege of pastoring for a season in New York City, Redeemer Presbyterian Church. Before I got there, at 9/11, in the aftermath of 9/11, a lot of people who would have identified as irreligious or just religion was not that important to their life, found themselves in church. Why? Because the outer things that they were building their lives upon proved not to be durable. 9/11 just cracked right through a lot of those assumptions. They became a lot more interested in it. Stripped away the facade, you might say. Another option, though, for the less religious or irreligious person when those outer shells begin to crack is that it might work the other way. Instead of moving in the direction of finding God, it might move them further away from God. It might be just sort of this cynical confirmation, well, there it just goes to show you. Life is meaningless. It's insane to believe in a God. Religion is the opiate of the masses. It's there as a power play, a controlling device by religious figures and organizations, and you run further away from that. It's not worth it, in other words. Okay, that's from there. There's at least three options, and I realize I could be reducing this down to things that might make you, where you personally are, feel like I'm being naive or not respecting you, and I don't mean that at all. But so three options of coming to the conclusion God is not real because of the suffering you're going through. One is that if God were real, he just wouldn't allow this. So this is the age-old question, goes all the way back to the book of Job that we looked at last Sunday, that if there really is a God and he's powerful, then he wouldn't allow this kind of thing to happen in my life. It's the philosophical, theological question of theodicy. God, how does a good, powerful God vindicate himself in the face of what appears to be unjust suffering? And a lot of people have dealt with this over the years. It's something that C.S. Lewis, as an atheist, really struggled with. And as he went through his own process of working through this, he came to the conclusion, he said, it was, as it turned out, atheism proved to be far too simple a solution. Because it occurred to him at one point, well, if I have this sense of injustice, the suffering that I'm going through is unjust, if there really is a good God who's powerful, then where did I get that assumption? Where did that come from? That if there isn't a God, then life is just meaningless, and some existential assumption that I have butted up against injustice is really just something I've conjured up in my own mind. But if indeed it actually is real, then it must come from some place of injustice. And you can't really have that, Lewis concluded, without the existence of God. That's one potential in terms of coming to the conclusion that there really couldn't be a God. Religion is bogus because of the suffering they're going through. Another is that there is a God, but he's not powerful enough to deal with it. And a lot of people over the years have come to this conclusion. Harold Kushner, in his book from many years ago, but wildly popular, Why Bad Things Happen to Good People. That's the assumption there, is that there is a God, but there are warring factions of power in the cosmos that come to play in crises, human crises, and though God didn't want this evil to happen to you, he really couldn't do much about it at the end of the day. You might come to that conclusion, but as an irreligious person, you're like, well, what good is that kind of a God for me anyway? If he can't help me, then he just seems like this metaphysical appendage to my life, and you jettison him. And then the third option is, well, if there is a God and he's allowed this to happen and he could have controlled it otherwise, then he's really just cruel. And you could probably think of even worse vocabulary to ascribe to him. And so for any of those three reasons and more, you conclude that you're just going to flee from God, any conception of God. Now, that's the person who's less religious or completely irreligious by their own description. What about the person who's more religious? This is a Christian, let's say someone whose faith they would say is important to them. This is where I would place myself, of course. They hit a time of intense suffering. Those outer layers, remember, we're kind of an onion, we're a series of concentric circles. Those outer layers of belief, assumptions of life that we're operating on to begin to crack. And the interesting thing is that at this point, the Christian is not all that different than the non-Christian, or the person who would describe themselves as more religious is not all that different in the options of where they go than the irreligious person. For instance, you could come to the conclusion that if God was really real and powerful, then he wouldn't allow this. A lot of people come to that conclusion. Or you could say, well, kind of when good things happen to bad people, when bad things happen to good people, conclusion. Well, there is a God, but he couldn't really help it. A lot of religious people seem to be able to live there. I think the question that I would have then is of what practical day-to-day use is this God to you? And then the third option is to come to the conclusion that he's just cruel. So there's a lot of similarities between the irreligious and more religious response at this point, with two significant differences. That first response of, well, if there really is a God, then and that he is powerful, he wouldn't allow this. The more religious nuance to that can be along these lines. If God were real and he was powerful, then my life wouldn't have turned out this way. To strip back really what's going on in the heart, it's more along the lines of God owes me, that my dream in life, where I really thought this faith thing was taking me, was toward happiness, towards my life. It's sort of a progressive view of life, an evolutionary view of life with God part of it. And this doesn't square with that kind of a notion. Another nuance to the more religious person's conclusions here is instead of God being merely cruel, this takes a more dark shade to it, which is that God is cruel to me because of me. This is if you go to the book of Job, this is where Job's friends were headed, frankly. It's like, Job, everybody says you're such a great guy. You are going through intense suffering and pain. Clearly, as we connect these dots, it must mean that you screwed up, that you're a facade, and your faith is, and so stop being so self-righteous and repent and clean up your life, and things will go okay. And see how dark that is when especially you're doing self-talk about these kinds of things. I must be a bad person. God must not really love me. I know I'm supposed to believe God loves me, but because of what I'm going through, I know he's in control. I must be a bad person to him. So it turns very dark, and so the result for the religious and irreligious person means that you can either abandon God outright, you enter into kind of a dysfunctional relationship with him, on the other hand, or the third way, the right way, is the healthy way. How do we have more of a healthy relationship with God? So let me try to I spent more time on that first part than I wanted to, but let me try to summarize it this way. How do we process suffering in the healthiest way possible? Again, whether you describe yourself as an unbeliever, a less religious person, or a more convinced Christian. First thing is we've got to be self-aware. It means that we know what those outer layers, those outer assumptions, you say you're a Christian, fine, but is that really what your life is built upon in terms of the day-to-day hopes and dreams? So that when the suffering comes and the outer layers are cracked, your life falls apart, what does that reveal about you? So it means that we're listening to ourselves, that they were asking those heart questions. What are those real assumptions? What am I building my life upon? Guess what? We can't do this on our own. Some of us are more self-aware than others, but if you're not identifying with what I'm saying, read Walker Percy's book, Lost in the Cosmos. And he essentially said, for as incredibly advanced as we are as human creatures into the 21st century, we are utterly obtuse and stupid when it comes to self-awareness. So we need a lot of help here. We need to do this in community. We need people who know us well, who will speak into our lives in both truth and love at the same time. We need professionals, therapists, counselors, to help us along the way. Being self-aware. Secondly, in terms of how do we move forward in a healthy way, whether you consider yourself a Christian or not. Secondly, is to give Christianity a fighting chance. Why? Because if it's true, if it's real, just think of all the resources that we're leaving on the table. Massive resources. And I'm not just talking about the next life, like how do you face death? That is a big part of it, but not reducing it to that. Massive resources. Christianity promises that the Holy Spirit comes to live inside a believer. We're there alone, having God inside of you to take on whatever life brings to bear. That when you become a Christian, you're not a better person. You are a new person. massively important in terms of resources. And it has the capacity, these resources, to penetrate to those deepest layers of the concentric circles that we are as people. So self-aware, give Christianity a fighting chance. Third, engage where you are. Raw, real, honest. You see this so often in the Bible. The Bible doesn't say, come and figure out the right way to talk to God and religious speak and then God will listen to you. No, it's saying, be real. If you have doubts, God is not afraid of your doubts. John the Baptist, who Jesus said was the greatest person who'd ever walked the face of the earth, had serious doubts at one point in his life about Jesus. Psalm 13 is indicative of many places in the Psalms. How long, Lord, will you forget me forever? So come to God honestly, authentically, engage with him. The freedom to be in process is what this is saying. The freedom to ascribe a lot of things to mystery. Mystery says that we are finite. I talked about this last Sunday. That we are finite, and therefore, while we are brilliant in many ways, complex beings, we know very little about ultimate things. Very little. And so it's okay not to have the billion-piece puzzle that life is all put together and figured out. And the next point, so now I'm number 4, self-aware, give Christianity a fighting chance, engage honestly. The fourth is the starting point is the resurrection in terms of a concrete conviction about the truthfulness of Christianity. And here I would say 2 things. One, listen to Paul. Paul didn't believe in Christianity at all, the Apostle Paul. He wanted to stomp out the nascent Christian movement of the first century until something important happened. The resurrected Jesus Christ appeared to him, and it radically changed his whole life. And Paul ended up saying basically, and I'm paraphrasing using the language of Eugene Peterson's the Message, but if Christianity isn't true, then it's just, why are you wasting your life on smoke and mirrors? But if it is true, which Paul had come to the conclusion it absolutely was, then you've got this rock solid, ruthlessly historical, concrete basis to always come back to. And I've got to tell you, a zillion times over my Christian life, I became a Christian, I think, about age 18, I've had to come back to this because life didn't make sense. Couldn't put things together. God, are you real because of this? Coming back to the resurrection as my default anchors me and allows me to move forward from there. It steadies me. The other thing I was going to say about the resurrection is the best single book outside the Bible on this subject is by Tom Wright, N.T. Wright, Anglican bishop, brilliant scholar. His book, The Resurrection of the Son of God, is the most comprehensive consolidation of evidence and logic to the resurrection of Jesus. And therefore, if Jesus could, one of the things that Tom Wright says, if Jesus could overcome our greatest obstacle, death, then everything else, it's an argument from the greater to the lesser, everything else is a lesser form of death in our life, and he therefore has the authority and capacity to help us to deal with those things. All right, resurrection, and then finally build a robust experiential theology. I don't have time to go into all this because I poorly budgeted my time, but in the last couple of minutes that we've got, let me just race through a couple of things. And thanks to all of you that are tuning in. Begin where the Bible begins. The first couple of chapters talk about our original design, that life is by design a a good sovereign God who created everything and us as the crown jewel of his creation. But very importantly, the purpose of everything isn't ultimately to bring you and me happiness. As C.S. Lewis said, if that were what Christianity and religion were all about, I've got a bottle of port that can do that more efficiently. But Christianity is ultimately, life is ultimately about bringing glory to the one who made it. It's what we were made to be thrilled by and come alive by. Now, penultimately, we find our greatest delight and happiness in giving him glory, as the Westminster Shorter Catechism, question 1, famously has put it. But that same design tells us, Genesis 3, that life is broken, and that you and I, from that point forward in the narrative story of the Bible, you and I we were cast out of utopia. We live in the wilderness, and we are wanderers, we are pilgrims throughout this life. That is the paradigm that we must hold on to. But God, in the midst of that, is a gracious and kind God to us, relentlessly so. Ultimately, all other forms of grace are ultimately pointing to the ultimate form of grace given to us in God's Son, Jesus. As Dorothy Sayers put it, we know that we can trust this God because he wasn't immune to suffering himself. He wasn't pontificating from above about suffering to us. But he took it on, as Dorothy Sayers says, he tasted his own medicine for us in his Son by suffering, being the suffering servant who ultimately died for us. And because of that, love wins. God, even when we can't make sense of suffering, we know, as followers of Jesus, we know that love wins, that he loves us, that it's never about us being bad people and God's punishing us, that he is at work refining and shaping us through our suffering, and that we are the apple of his eye. He actually cares for us. And that this robust theology ultimately leads to an eschatology, that is, an understanding of not just the end times, but life beyond this age. That, as Jesus says toward the end of the Bible, Revelation 21, I am going to make everything new. Or, as another great theologian, Samwise Gamgee, toward the end of the Lord of the Rings, said, when things started to change, he said, is it true that everything sad is going to come untrue? And the Bible says absolutely. That we're wilderness wanderers now. Hold on by faith. That ultimate day is coming. And when we shape our lives, not just the exterior assumptions, the shell of our life, but when we bring these truths into the deepest corners of our soul, you know what that theology becomes, that robust theology? It becomes a theology unto doxology, that we begin to actually love and enjoy and praise this God, even in the midst of things we can't make sense of and are so deeply painful. Well, there's a lot that we've just talked about. I hope that this is helpful to you. Thanks for those of you who gave me questions that I tried my best to bake into this interaction. Join us this Sunday, 10:30 a.m., 5 o'clock p.m. Central Time, citychurch.org. And thanks again for watching. Hope you have a great rest of your week.